we're going to continue our discussion about how those three prongs of liberalism, nationalism, and socialism are going to continue to play out through, especially this part, we're going to be dealing with a lot of Western civilization, but we're also going to be dealing about Western Asia with the Ottoman Empire and places like that. And so there's a lot of different major movements that we're going to be dealing with. One of them, if not the main one, one of the main ones is going to be, of course, the unification processes that are going to be played out in both Italy and in Germany. And we'll see a couple of these examples will give us an idea of part of the reason why the 20th century happens the way that it does is because of how these processes take place here in the middle part of the 19th century. But we're also going to be dealing with science and the scientific movement and how it begins to affect world thought as well. Well, when we last let the French off, they had managed to have an election, and we're thinking, okay, well, good. Right? Well, the 1848 revolutions are pretty successful here in France, right? You sweep the king out. We're not going to have an autocracy. We're going to vote in a president, right? And of course, that president that they vote in is Louis Napoleon, who is Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, and well, yeah, it ends in autocracy. Big surprise there, right? So what you're going to see here is Louis Napoleon's a pretty savvy guy. He's a pretty savvy political character, and what he does is he turns this nationalistic emotional sentimentality that the French have towards Napoleon into his bid for the presidency, and then of course he's going to turn the presidency into this springboard for personal autocratic power. His main avenue for this is going to be appealing to French nationalism, and he's going to ask for and receive a lot of nationalistic support for his policies of imperialism, and one is going to feed off of the other. Hey, let's go and beat up some of these North Africans. Aren't we great? Yeah, hooray for us. And then you'll ignore the fact that I'm kind of trouncing on liberalism. Right? He is going to crown himself Emperor Napoleon III in this line, starting with Napoleon Bonaparte, and then of course skipping a generation that didn't actually have political power to himself, the nephew. Napoleon III. He's going to use this autocratic power to control and stimulate the French economy. Again, you see that this is something that's indicative of especially French absolutists. But a lot of these people in a lot of these other countries, they want to see economic expansion, but not for the reasons that, say, a liberal would want economic expansion, which is, well, it's what people want, and it makes people happy, and they can live and be free with their economic prosperity. I don't know that was really a big concern for this guy. He's interested in expanding especially the industrial sector, so that way it will be more conducive to creating a powerful nation state that he controls. So this is something that he shares with previous absolutist autocrats in French history. He's also going to be willing to rebuild Paris in a much more modern style. If you go to Paris today, you don't see the Paris of the French Revolution. You don't see the Paris of the 1700s. You see the Paris of the mid to late 1800s, and that is, you've got these extremely wide avenues, and these huge lanes, these giant traffic circles, and all this kind of stuff. Oh, it's really picturesque, and really gives you a good view of this. Also, it's much harder to erect barricades and have a revolution against Napoleon's government when you have these big wide streets, because you can't throw wagons and barricades across them and fight off the advancing army through these narrow winding streets. So yeah, Paris's new style is, it's attractive, it brings in the tourists, and also it's much harder to keep out the army from this kind of thing. Now, you're all going to have a lot of liberals in France that are going to begin to jostle against Napoleon's autocratic tendencies, which is, hey, people should be able to vote in different kinds of governments that they want. We should have budgetary power, how the money is spent. We should be able to talk about this. Napoleon III is going to liberalize the government some, but mostly just to keep these guys quiet. He would give budgetary power, for example, to the parliament, but he maintained the veto power on it for himself. He was still wildly popular, though, for nationalistic reasons, and of course that came from foreign policy. He was going up and beating up the Algerians and the Moroccans and people like that. And as long as he was doing that, he was extremely popular. Which begs the question, well, what's going to happen when foreign policy turns against him? And that's exactly what's going to happen here in 1870 and 1871 when he embarks on a war against Prussia, and the Prussians wind up winning, and that's what's going to bring him down as a result of that. So last time we saw him, he was in his suit and tie, and he was President Louis Napoleon, and now, of course, is Emperor Napoleon III. That didn't take really nearly as long as it should have, right? Also, one of the situations that we'd seen as a product of the Napoleonic Wars following on the French Revolution was the concert of Europe. The idea that these guys are going to get together and they're going to start talking about their problems rather than just sort of fighting each other and achieve, balance of power and try to have legitimacy and all this, all these issues that they wanted to try to create. Sort of a mini pre-United Nations kind of idea. And so you'll see these crop up throughout history in various places and at various times. And this, like all the other times, is going to break down, all right? Well, the central piece of this is going to be our large West Asian empire, and that's the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire had risen to really some impressive heights through the use of the Janissaries and highly centralized government and sort of a warlike approach towards driving back first the Byzantine Empire and these other Southeast European Christian states, the Habsburg Empire, but by the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire is kind of a shadow of its former self. It's a weakening power. The joke was that a lot of these countries called it the sick man of Europe. And so it still had ostensibly a lot of power and control throughout the Middle East, stretching eastward into Central Asia. But the reality was most of these countries and most of these areas had officially broken with Constantinople and no longer listened to the Sultan directly anymore. Russia, for example, by 1863, had pushed the Ottomans all the way back to the Danube River and had designs on the Dardanelles. Now, one of the things that you've got to understand here is that for centuries, the Russians and the Ottoman Empire had kind of been at war along their shared border, and especially on and around the shores of the Black Sea. This was a place where they had kind of gone back and forth, and at one point the Ottomans win and then the Russians win, and it's a lot of back and forth that takes place there. The ultimate goal, though, for the Russians, and the reason the Dardanelles and the Bosporus are so important, is if Russia can capture this whole area, is it can get its fleet into the Mediterranean and get its fleet thus into the rest of the world 12 months out of the year. Now, see, Russia is so far north that, generally speaking, all of its ports freeze in the wintertime. And while now, thanks to modern kind of ice-breaking technology, that's not as big of a deal as it was then. But back then, the ports would just freeze up and you were stuck there. And so if there's a war going on in the wintertime, the Russian Navy can't help you because it can't get out of port unless it had already left and gotten out of the port. And so the capture of the Dardanelles for the Russians would be a major game changer because now you have the Russians on the high seas all the time. So this is what's going to happen is there's friction between the Russians and the Ottomans. This pushes the Ottomans back into a diplomatic corner. Long story short, they declare war on the Russians. However, the Ottomans are joined in this war by Britain and France. Now, the reason for that is Britain and France didn't want to see Russian naval vessels on the high seas, especially not in the Mediterranean at all time. So you look at these countries that had come to this agreement by 1815 of, okay, we're going to work together and provide for the stability of Europe to, well, our national interests no longer coincide, so we're going to start fighting each other. And that's going to wreck it. Okay, so the Crimean War in its own sort of sense isn't that big of a deal. But in a diplomatic sense, it's going to be these countries that had a chance to work together and then they decided not to anymore. That's the major casualty of the Crimean War. The fighting itself is pretty straightforward and easy to understand. The Allies are going to attack Russia for the most part on the Crimean Peninsula, which sticks out into the Black Sea. And so hence that gives us the name of the fighting. I mean, there is some fighting that's going to take place in Bessarabia and around the Danube River. But for the most part, it's going to be the siege of this Crimean fortress of Sevastopol. And they're going to fight some battles that take place outside of the city. You get the Charge of the Light Brigade poem from this, where the British horsemen charge, I think Russian artillery or something like that. But they push these guys back, and they lay siege to Sevastopol, and they get closer and closer until eventually they crack one of the bastions. They break into Sevastopol, they capture the city, and the Russians realize, okay, the fighting's over, we've lost the war. All right. So, as I mentioned, the real casualty is the fact that the old alliances of Europe are now thrown onto the fire, and that the countries are basically left on their own to pursue their own nationalistic policies. England really had withdrawn by this point and was continuing to withdraw from a lot of the political discourses on the continent of Europe. They were interested in not having any one power rise up and be the dominant force in Europe. They don't want to see France do it. They don't want to see Russia do it. They don't want to see Germany do it. But for the most part, they're not intricately involved in, well, we want this here and we want that there. They just want to see balance of power. So for the most part, their own national interests are around the world. It's going to be in places like India, and it's going to be in places like China. And so they're going to concentrate, on places like Africa as a result of that. Now Russia is going to turn inward. It's going to concentrate in on itself. It had seen its expansionist policies being met by a check. Austria was left friendless because it had pledged its support for Russia. But then when it came down to it, and Russia said, okay, we're engaged in this war, you need to honor your pledges of alliance with us. And Austria's like, no, we don't really want to fight the British and the French, so you guys are on your own. What that meant was Russia said, fine, we're not friends anymore. You're going to have to find yourself another ally. Eventually, after some ups and downs, Austria is going to find an ally in the Germans. And so this little political cartoon gives you an idea of kind of how Europe is conceiving of itself at this point, where all the different countries are sort of drawn out as different people, and you'll see that the Russian, the giant sort of Russian Cossack-looking fellow, is staring greedily at the rest of Europe at this point. And so this gives you an idea of what's going on here, the early part of the fighting here, around the delta of the Danube and in Wallachia and places like that. That's going to start things off, but for the most part, the fighting is going to shift to the Crimean Peninsula, where you will have some battles like this, the Battle of Balaclava that takes place outside of the city. You can see the thin red line of British infantry as they go forward. But then most of it is going to be this siege of Sebastopol with these giant, sort of forts that the Russians are manning, and then the French and the British are attacking in various ways until eventually they would crack through and they would take the city and the Russians would surrender. When we deal with this unification process as it works itself out here in Europe, we've got two examples that we need to talk about. And one is going to be Italy, and the next one is going to be Germany. They happen very differently, and so thus, the product that we're going to get in terms of its political trajectory is going to be very different for both Italy and for Germany. All right? The place to start here for Italy is going to be with Piedmont. All right? Now, Italian nationalism, this idea that there should be one unified Italy because we all speak Italian, we all are Italian, that continued to grow despite the fact that in 1848 a lot of these small little republics and these city-states here in northern Italy had tried to break free and have their nationalist revolutions. They had been crushed. The Austrians had come back in and they'd smashed these guys and said, no, you're still going to be part of the Habsburg Empire. Well, the one exception to that was the small state of Piedmont. It was on the very sort of top west part of the Alpine provinces of Italy. And it was a liberal state. It had its prime minister, and it's going to have its own sort of elected government. And they're waiting really for the other shoe to drop. They know at some point Austria is going to march back in and probably try to make them submit to their rule. And so as a result of that, they're trying feverishly to get things in a situation where they can survive this. All right? Well, Austria is really politically isolated following its failure to participate in the Crimean War. The Russians are telling them, okay, we helped you against Hungary, and you're not going to help us here in the Crimea, and so fine, you're on your own. And of course, the Italians are very worried about, or the Austrians are very worried about, well, what are the other powers going to do? Because they don't like us either as a result of that. Well, Piedmont's prime minister is a guy named Camillo de Cavour. Right? He understood that in a straight-up fight, Piedmont, tiny little Piedmont, is not going to be able to smack around the Austrian Empire. So it's just not going to happen. But you need to be able to be prepared to meet whatever threat comes your way. So he's going to expand the small country's economy, build up a large cash base, and use that to try to provide for as much military defense by the army as possible. Now, more importantly, though, he organized an alliance system with France to try to drive the Austrians from northern Italy if the Austrians decided to invade. Now, the Austrians would invade. They would finally come after Piedmont. France did intervene, and they decided to send military aid, and they're going to help defeat the Austrians at a couple of battles at Magenta and Solferino. And then, of course, the French, they don't care a whole lot. The Piedmont, they're mostly looking at sort of checking Austrian power and making sure that the Austrians are held in their place. But to Piedmont, this means the world, all right? What this means is not only is Piedmont not going to get subdued by the Austrians, but this sends a signal to a lot of these other nationalistically inclined northern Italian city-states. Hey, the Austrians aren't invincible. We can defeat these guys. And these nationalist revolutions in northern Italy are then going to break themselves free of Austrian control, and they are then going to join with Piedmont. And so it turns out that Piedmont, this tiny little liberal state, is going to be the nucleus of the new Italian nation. And so here you can see this is the political situation for Italy at this point. You got country in the south, you got the Pope directly controls the central part of this, and you got a bunch of these northern Italian republics. There's Camillo de Cavour, right? He only has the beard, the gobble beard, which is kind of interesting, but this is him, and he's going to prove to be our interesting sort of fellow. And this is the intervention by the French at the Battle of Solferino, which proves to be crucial for Piedmontese independence. Right? So this is going on in the north, and we have a different state of affairs that's going on in the south. In the south, instead of Camillo de Cavour, we have another Italian nationalist, and it's a guy named Giuseppe Garibaldi. Right? Now, Garibaldi is not going to use political alliance, and liberal nation-state tactics with grand strategy to try to win independence. He is an ardent nationalist, and he's also a military guy. So he's going to use force, but he's also going to use the emotions of nationalism. And he forms this army of young volunteers. They call themselves the Red Shirts, and you can probably figure out why they call themselves the Red Shirts, because they wore red shirts, right? This is back when political movements made sense. All right? And they were dedicated to fighting for a unified Italian nation. And they're going to start here in the south, where they're going to land in Sicily, which is this island that's off the toe of the Italian boot. And as they would succeed in overrunning these fortifications by these various sort of feudal governments, they would add more and more people to their cause. And he would lead this military campaign up the Italian peninsula, overthrowing more and more of these local feudal leaders. Now, at this point, Cavour isn't totally trusting Garibaldi. He doesn't want to see him overrun all of Italy. And also he understands that this is a great opportunity, that while most of the military forces of Italy are positioned against Garibaldi, Cavour is going to use this opportunity to move down into central Italy, minus the city of Rome. So what he decides to do is he and Garibaldi, they get together and they put the issue of unification to a vote in 1860. And of course, not too much of a surprise. You ask these people, should we not have an awesome, mega, terrific, united Italy? Well, yeah, who doesn't want mega, awesome, terrific? I forget exactly how they word it, but basically this plebiscite is it's a pretty straightforward kind of affair. Don't you want a united Italy? Well, yeah, who wouldn't want that, right? So the plebiscite passes, to no one's surprise, and it leads to national unification. The one exception to this is the city of Rome itself. And of course, Rome is the home of the popes. Right? And France had long held that it was their job to make sure that this area was protected so it could be independent. But of course, Garibaldi and Cavour are like, no, Rome should be the capital of Italy. We're not going to, we're Catholic too. It's not like we're going to go in and slit the Pope's throat. So it was a France-Italy kind of thing. Anyway, when Italy and Prussia defeated the Austrians, or when Prussia defeats the Austrians in 1866, the Italians are going to move in and take Venice, which the Austrians have been outposting. And then Rome is going to be left undefended when France loses its war with Germany in 1871. So these are going to be the last two little pickups from this. There's Garibaldi, and there's these guys, and big surprise, they're wearing red shirts. And so this is them. They're breaking into one of these little fortified areas in southern Italy, and you can see that the population is greeting him as a liberator. Hey, this guy's here, we're nationalists. And so Garibaldi's army kept getting bigger and bigger. So this is Italian unification. And it happens along the lines of liberalism and, at least in part, and fervent kind of nationalism. And so that's what's going to take place here. This is going to be a little different when we talk about Germany. All right? And to start with Germany, we don't start with a small little liberal state of Piedmont. We're going to start with a relatively large autocratic state of Prussia. All right? Now, by 1850, Prussia was the dominant single country in and amongst the many, many much smaller German states through a trades customs union. Now, the reason for this was because of the railroad system that ran all throughout Central Europe by this point. And for those of you that have ever gone, kind of overseas to go travel or whatever, whenever you stop in a new country, you have to stop, you have to pay tolls, and you have to pay customs, and you got to show them your passport, and you got to do this. And it's time-consuming, and it slows everything down. Now, Germany at this point, there was not a Germany. There were 365 Germanys. Some of them were pretty big, like Prussia. Some of them were almost as big as they were, like Bavaria. You had some that were sort of medium-sized, like Swabia and Westphalia and stuff like that. And then you had some really kind of tiny little ones that were big enough to walk across in a day or so. So you had, a Germany for every single day of the year. And so if you're going to ride these kind of things, you have to stop at every one of these and pay customs and pay tolls, and it would drive up the cost. And so basically what the Prussians did was they said, okay, Berlin will be the clearinghouse for all this, and we will dole out the money. If it passed through your country, then we'll make sure you get your cash, and it's much more efficient, and it's much more to the point. And of course, it fits the German mold of this. All right. Now, it's important the fact that everyone was looking to Prussia for their paycheck. The fact that the Prussians were the ones organizing all of this for the railway customs, in that they're the ones that are going to have access to then a lot of political power, right? Prussia itself, during the revolutions here of 1848 and then on into 1849, Prussia had instituted a few liberal reforms, but for the most part, not really, right? It was still, for the most part, a staunchly autocratic state. The king had this power, and he was going to use it, and in fact, what you're going to see here is he's going to be pretty good at fending off calls for liberal change, right? There were a lot of people inside Prussia who did have these liberal ideas that, hey, we need a constitution, and we need civil liberties, and we need budgetary power for the people, self-determination, etc., etc., okay? So the king is facing a lot of criticism as a result of that. Wilhelm is going to strengthen the army to make sure that he has control over this, but he realizes he's going to have to make some political moves in order to head off this. And really one of the great, important political moves of all time is the appointment of this really, really conservative, reactionary aristocrat, Otto von Bismarck, as the Chancellor of the German Reichstag. He's going to be the leader of the parliament. He's going to be leader of the legislature for this. Bismarck himself, whether you like him or whether you hate him, is one of the most important people in really all of world history because of his ability to keep liberals from gaining any advances. All right. He had been a former bureaucrat. He had been briefly an army guy. He was a rich, Easterner, one of these Junkers, landowning guys. I think the guy drank like a bottle of champagne every morning at breakfast. I mean, the guy, he drank all the time. He was a big dude, but he understood how to defeat these people. All right. And what Bismarck did was he brought the liberal agencies of the government in line to make sure that they were doing what the king wanted them to do, and he would fire these people if they gave him problems. And in terms of overall foreign policy, he instituted this idea they called realpolitik, right? Realistic politics, where a nation seeks a realistic and in many cases opportunistic foreign policy. What are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to do this. Well, let's do the things that it takes to make that happen. Well, we may have to be friends with these people, and they're jerks. So, we may have to be mean to these people, and we really like them. So anyway, this is realpolitik. Is you deal with things as they are, and you deal with what you have to do in order to accomplish the goals that you've set for yourself. All right. Now, Bismarck understood the need for military power, but military power had its place. It was wrong. Some people, sort of lump Bismarck into this warmonger status. All he wanted to do was fight these wars, and wars were all that mattered to him. No, that's an over-exaggeration. Okay. For example, they'll quote his Eisen und Blut speech. Germany's made out of iron and blood. That kind of stuff. And they take that a little bit out of context. So Bismarck was not afraid to use warfare, but he did it in a very specific way. While he's going to lead Prussia into 3 major wars, the reason that he did this was they were very specifically focused, and more importantly, they are going to force the liberal-minded parliament into making a choice. Either you can continue to clamor for liberalism, or you can go along with the rising tide of nationalism. All right? And so that's what he's going to do with this. So there's Bismarck, and I include this in the slideshow because it really gets the point across. You really want to go against this guy. Here he is with this one. He would often appear on the floor of the Reichstag in his military uniform. Technically, he had been some junior officer in some military, I forget which military regiment of the Prussian military. But like a lot of young guys who really had other things on his mind, I don't think a serious military career was what he wanted. So technically, he was allowed to wear his military uniform. But the reason you do that is if people are going to disagree with you and they're going to boo at you or whatever, you don't do that. That's disrespecting the uniform. So it's a way to keep people shut up. They won't criticize me. They're going to be criticizing the uniform as well. Now, as I mentioned, Bismarck did have a pretty strong military policy for Prussia, but it was coupled directly with what specific diplomatic goals they were trying to accomplish. All right. The reason that he did this in the way that he did was the one supported the other. And diplomacy was always the way that you would start things off. Because before every one of these, what you're going to see that Bismarck makes sure that happens is any foe that you're going to face needs to be diplomatically isolated. So that way you're only dealing with one at a time. You don't want to have to fight, multiple front wars. You don't want to have to deal with this guy and his friend. You're just going to deal with this country, and you're going to fight them, and it's going to be with this. And one of the things you'll also notice too is Prussia is going to face potential enemies on an ever-escalating level. Okay. So the first target of German expansion is going to be Denmark. All right, Denmark is this little, peninsula and actually a series of islands that sticks out into the North Sea, right, and it juts off of the northern end of Germany, right. Well, one of the problems here is that the southern area of Denmark was called Schleswig-Holstein, okay, and you had Danes in, I think, the Schleswig part and Germans in the Holstein part. Now, logic would tell you that, well, you just get the saw out and you just cut the German part away and you give the German part to Germany and the Danish part to the Danes. It's a little too logical for these people. The reason that it was stuck together was due to some ancient feudal title holding kind of thing that doesn't make any sense even in the 1800s, much less today, okay? But the idea here is that these Germans that are in Denmark, they're going to be stuck outside of what was going to be a unified Germany. So Prussia is going to ally itself with Austria to another Germanic control state to go in and split this captured territory. They're going to fight the Danes, right? And they're going to go after these guys. They're going to overrun these frontier fortresses. They're going to take Schleswig-Holstein, and then us and Austria will split, right? Prussia and Austria will split the administration of Schleswig-Holstein after a very quick war. And as you would imagine, with Austria and Prussia ganging up on itty-bitty Denmark, the Danes are beaten pretty soundly. And that's exactly what is going to happen, all right? One of the problems that Bismarck is going to face in unifying Germany is Austria itself. He knows that Prussia can't take over Austria because of the Habsburgs. They control this, and the Habsburgs control this huge empire. So what he's got to do is he's got to form a Germany where Austria is going to be left out of it, but isn't going to try to interfere with this. All right. So what Bismarck is going to do is make sure that Austria stays isolated following the Crimean War, and then he uses this pretext in this area that they were jointly controlling to declare war on Austria here in 1866. All right. So this is this area. This is Schleswig-Holstein. This little pink salmon-colored area of the map. So this is Denmark, and then down south of here, this is Germany. This is the German troops. These Prussian troops are overrunning these frontier fortresses. It's a pretty quick and fairly easy victory for the Prussians in this regard. But very, very different facing Denmark than it is facing Austria. Austria had a very large multinational empire. Prussia was a lot smaller here in 1866. And in fact, most people expected the much larger Austrian Empire, and most of these sort of military experts here in 1866, they really expected the Austrians to kind of thrash the Prussians. They figured the Prussians were getting kind of too big for their britches, and they really needed a comeuppance, right? The problem with this, though, was while quantitatively the Austrians were much larger, qualitatively the Prussians were doing something, or a lot of things, in a very new way. The Prussians made a lot of military advances that were difficult, if not impossible, for the Austrians to counter. They had breech-loading rifles, which greatly increased the both accuracy and rate of fire of their infantry. They also heavily used the railroads to very quickly concentrate troops into a very narrow front over a short period of time. They also used the telegraph for instant communications with their frontline commanders to help coordinate these movements. And brilliant staff work by the general staff of the Prussian military, von Moltke, to coordinate all of this, to make sure that not only all the troops wind up where they're supposed to be and they're fighting in the way that they're supposed to be, but also supplies are reaching the front, lines of communication are working the way that they're supposed to. All of this is going to come to a major blow-off moment at the Battle of Königgrätz, all right? And what you're going to have is Prussia is going to fight off very large numbers of the Austrian troops, and then using their swift maneuvers and their railroads to bring in troops to kind of crush the Austrian flank, and they're going to win decisively. And so they're going to be maintaining their kind of defensive posture, and then they bring in these guys, and they're going to win as a result of that. Well, after this big blow-off battle here at Königgrätz, right, the Austrians realize, okay, we can't beat the Prussians, and it's time to go to the peace treaty table, right? Well, at the negotiations, the Prussians decided not to punish Austria. They decided not to make an enemy out of Austria and said, we're going to take a whole bunch of your territory, we're going to take a whole bunch of your money, we're not going to treat you guys like that, right? The idea was they just wanted to exclude Austria from German affairs and leave the rest of Germany to basically be under the control of Prussia. The Austrians, okay, fine, that's what we'll do, right? Moreover, what you're going to see is this victory over a major European power is really going to vindicate Bismarck and his autocratic ideas and really kind of suck the wind out of the sails of a lot of these liberals, because many of these liberals, we want rights and liberty and we want freedom, and well, we just won this big war and you want to complain? So it really, what Bismarck was doing was he was giving these guys a choice. You can either have nationalist victory with us autocrats, or you can continue to whine about your liberal goals. And so this was a tough choice for a lot of these people, especially in the Reichstag, to make. And so as a result of that, liberal reform got kind of pushed to the back burner in a lot of cases. All right. So this is how he was going to be dealing with these guys over the course of time. So these military successes, the government of Prussia, and then eventually, as we see, the rest of Germany joins Prussia, okay, is going to become less democratic and more autocratic over time, rather than what you're seeing throughout most of the rest of the world, or at least most of the Western world at this point. So here you can see some of these guys at the Battle of Königgrätz. You can see the Prussian guys with their breech-loading rifles as they're going forward. There's von Moltke. He's observing this whole thing as the general staff guy. And I like how they've got everybody kind of around him. A lot of these younger staff officers, they look really, really nervous. Oh, this isn't going to work out. And he says, it's cool. Don't worry, I got a plan. And then you can see coming in from the other direction is going to be these Prussian reserves that are eventually going to outflank the Austrian army. And this is the moment where you can see, hooray, right? Hooray for Prussia. This is not the moment when they're cheering, a victorious battle to say, really, I'd like to see more freedom of the press. It doesn't work within this milieu, and Bismarck was very cognizant of that. So, ever increasingly, what you're seeing is all of these other smaller German states are looking towards Prussia and be like, Prussia's really got some stuff figured out. They've got a good system, they're organized, and how do we know that that's true? Is they just beat the stuffing out of the Austrians, right? The ultimate blow-off conflict is going to come with France, okay? France is also very cognizant of the fact that Prussia is making the rest of Germany kind of gravitate towards it, and one of the things they don't want to see is a massive united Germany on their eastern border. They like the thought of Germany being kind of separated. They could kind of keep these guys under control. There were a lot of them, but they weren't united. And so the idea of a single united Germany just across the Rhine River is pretty scary for these guys. So Bismarck is extremely aware of the fact that France is operating at top speed to try to prevent any kind of German unification. And so he understands, again, that one of the things that will unify Germany around Prussia, like nothing else, is going to be a war. Right? Bismarck is going to use this dispute over Spanish succession. He's going to actually fudge some correspondences from the Prussian king, and he gets this published in France, and of course it insults the French, and France declares war. All right. One of the things that, of course, a lot of these German states of varying size had said, hey, look, in a war with France, we're going to send troops to fight under Prussian military command. All right. And of course, France kind of discounted this. What are these other states going to fight with, alongside Prussia for? Well, it turns out that in the event of war, that's exactly what happens. The German states are going to send their troops. All right, and they're going to serve under Prussian both military and political leadership. They understood the idea that, okay, we all got to fight together, so we're going to link arms, and we're going to all go under one banner, and that is what is going to happen. And the war itself, if you're interested in the military history side of this, is just a brilliant display of overall better organization, maneuver, and even all the way down to the tactical level on the part of the Germans. They're going to break through the French front at Sedan on their eastern border. Emperor Napoleon III is going to actually be present at the defense of Sedan. They're going to surround the city, they're going to break in, and they're going to capture it. Okay? Not too much of a surprise, you're going to see that very quickly the French are going to repudiate Napoleon, and they're going to remove him as their emperor. But now they've got to limp along and try to fight this war with new political leadership. We're going to see the Prussian army, the German army is going to maneuver all throughout France using the railroad system, really kind of to a T. The Germans have this art of maneuver down to almost a science, and they're going to surround Paris. They're going to lay siege to the city for 5 months until eventually the Parisians are, okay, that's it, we're starving to death. we surrender, right? German troops are going to march into the French capital. They're going to occupy cities like Orleans, and we're going to see that they are then going to occupy the old palatial estates of Versailles. This is then going to create this great political moment where Bismarck is going to bring all these German princes in, and he's going to bring them in front of the king, and they're going to say, hey, who is it that's led us all to great victory? Well, this guy, yeah, hooray, right? Well, he should be our leader all the time, right? Hooray! And so the formation of the German Empire, of Germany, is going to come as a direct result of a pep rally from following a successful war. Moreover, like last time when we had said that in the 1848 revolutions, elected representatives had tried to offer the Prussian king the emperorship, he turns it down. No, you guys are voted, elected people from the gutter. I don't think so, right? Now, when it's German princes, his people, the aristocrats, who offer him the same job, he takes it, okay? It had been Prussian militarist leadership that had led these guys to success, and they're going to be now the new political leadership of a united Germany, right? Now, the peace settlement that Germany is going to concoct with France was inherently unfair and extremely humiliating to the French. They had to pay a huge indemnity of money. They had to give up territory. The industrial basin of Alsace-Lorraine is going to have to go over to the Germans, all right? And they had to watch German troops occupy France for 3 years while they were busy paying this off. So these are Prussian forces. They're coming out of the woods here at Sedan. There you can see them with their breech-loading rifles as they're advancing forward. This is them breaching the outer defenses of Sedan, working their way through the streets, fighting off these French defenders. Here you can see an overall operation level map of how these guys, they break through and then they use the lines of internal communication of the road and railroad system until eventually they would surround Paris and block off all these other reinforcements from reaching and giving these guys a lot of help. Here you can see the principle of, this is a Prussian colonel. He's been wounded and he stays at the front. This is a leadership principle that the Germans had that inculcate into their military, which while you suffer, as you can see here, a lot of casualties amongst your leadership, it's very inspiring. Also, it gives the local commanders a lot of eyes on to what's going on in the situation. So even your commanders of brigades and things like that, you got to be right at the front lines. Your divisional commanders, you got to see what's going on, so that way you can order your men in right at the right moment with this. And this is them breaking into Orleans in southern France, or in central France, and you can see these guys are breaching the wall and they're working their way in, and they've called in some French Foreign Legion troops to try to defend the area. And this is Prussian troops, and they're occupying the French city of Orleans, just like they would with Paris and with all these other places. And this is this moment. There's Bismarck, and then there's the king, right? And the German princes are acclaiming him as the emperor. And this is a title, unlike before, he is going to accept. He's going to take this. And so this is Germany, the green, this is the Austrian Empire, but then everything else is going to get added to Germany. And then here's a little political cartoon to give you an idea that one of the other political results of this is this happens at the expense of the French. Okay? We've got our Germanic, sort of Teutonic, Viking kind of warrior guy with his battle axe, sort of got the Thor helmet going on, right? And he's four-star French guy with the fleur de lis on his jacket, and he's broken his sword. He's forced him down, but you can see the French guy is defiant, okay? And you will see that this is going to be one of the recurring themes between 1871 and 1914 is the French, revanche, right? They're going to be shouting, again, right? They want another shot at the Germans. They're so mad at them for how they treated them following the Franco-Prussian War that this hyper-nationalism that they're going to have is, we've got to get Alsace-Lorraine back. We've got to get revenge on the Germans. And so this is something that's going to be an overall theme that's going to be boiling in France and to a certain extent Germany following this war. Right? So when we look at how this plays out though in some other places, a good example of this, especially in terms of nationalism, is going to be the development of the dual monarchy into an official kind of thing in the Habsburg Empire. Right? Now the Habsburgs, they had survived these revolutions of 1848. They managed to reinstitute the authoritarian rule that they had prior to this. But it's not all smooth sailing for them, right? The Italians in 1859 are going to be successful against them, at the behest of the Piedmontese. They're going to get some help from the French, right? They're defeated again in 1866, and so the Habsburgs look pretty weak. Nationalists within their empire are sensing some blood in the water, especially the Hungarians, who are saying, maybe this is the opportunity to start breaking away, okay? Well, the Austrians don't want to lose Hungary. This is an incredibly important part of their empire, right? So to keep them in line, the Hungarians formalized this idea of a dual monarchy. All right? You had the Austrian emperor. He was an emperor over all this kind of stuff, but he was also the king of Hungary. Right? This had existed before, but it really gets put into place here because Hungary at this point basically is given almost total autonomy. They're almost independent for its domestic affairs starting here in 1867. They could have their own budget, they could do their own trade rules, they could treat the people that lived there however they wanted to. The only thing that they had to go together was on foreign policy. They couldn't declare war by themselves. Their army had to work with the Austrian army, right? But what we're going to see is, interestingly enough, is once Austria is freed from Hungarian, the burden of having to deal with the Hungarians trying to break free every other minute, and the Hungarians are free for the most part, trying to break away from Austria, both of them pursue a similar policy of dominating their smaller minority groups within their borders. I find this particularly ironic for Hungary, which is we're an oppressed minority. Oh, we feel so bad. We're Hungarians and we're oppressed by these Germans, these Austrians, right? Give us our independence. And when they get almost total independence, what is it? They turn around and they oppress all the minority groups that are living inside of what was then Hungary. So there we go, right? There's our Kaiser, right? This is our Austrian Habsburg Emperor. I think it's Franz Joseph? I think so. There he is much, much later. You can see that the age has not worn well on him. And so this is the dual monarchy. This is how it goes. The red part is still all that's directly under control by the Habsburgs, and then indirectly under control, the Hungarians have almost total autonomy there in green. Now when you blow up that green part, you realize that the Hungarians, the green, they're not everything that's in there. You got Romanians, Slovakians, Croatians, Serbs, Germans, Ruthenians, Italians, Slovenians, Czechs. Oh boy, right? It's kind of a nasty little mess that you're going to see here in Hungary. And of course, they're going to pursue, for the most part, policies that are going to treat these people pretty badly, like oppressed minorities, right? Now, when we look on the outside of continental Europe, when we start looking around the world, right, we're going to see some big changes as a result of this, but not for the same reasons, right? Liberalism, nationalism, socialism, they don't have quite the same effect in different places, right? Now, while Britain, for the most part, had been spared the revolutions of 1848, you have street protests and you have that, but it doesn't lead directly to revolution. It's dominated through this period by the cultural emanations, really, from Queen Victoria herself. This is referred to as the Victorian era. She exemplified what was perceived to be dignity, duty to country, honor, and all of these sort of cultural features of this. You're also going to see that thanks to markets around the world, a global empire, and improving industrialization at home, England is going through a period of a pretty steady uptick in terms of standard of living, and you're also going to see that many more of these middle-class people are going to have the wherewithal to emulate the not only material possessions but also the cultural milieu of the upper class. So you've got that as well, right? England is slowly expanding its franchise, the number of people that can vote throughout this period, along with a number of other reforms. So this is going to help stave off any future revolutions as well. And as I had mentioned before, Britain is going to concentrate a lot on the expansion of its overseas empire. Right? Now the U.S. had dealt with its major problems decisively in the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. Slavery and the states' federal conflict that this problem had underscored. Right? The southern states seceded in 1861, but they were forced back into the Union, long story short, by massive numbers of federal troops. Okay? They did have some impressive military victories, but they were, they're never big enough to really destroy the Union Army as a result of that. So, slavery in 1865 is going to come to an end. Now, following the war, we're going to see that a lot of people are going to be focusing on other things. City construction, massive industrialization, and so that by the end of the century, you're going to see that Germany is actually going to be the #1 industrial power in Europe. The United States is going to be the #1 industrial power in the world. So there's Queen Victoria, right? She wears a white wedding dress, which is why we still have brides that wear white wedding dresses today, and that's to emulate Queen Victoria. A lot of people, oh, it's for purity, and it's for all this. Sure, why not? The real reason is Victoria got married in a white one, and it was stunning, and so people started copying it. So there you go, right? There's her in the 1890s. She doesn't look terribly amused to me, but this is her. She's an official, she's regal, she's stately, and this is how a lot of Britons can conceive of their relationship to the state. Devoted, honorable, and they want to be like her. This is her with her husband. This is Prince Albert. And so anyway, that's her and him, and they would have this. He was a German prince, and they had these half German children. So anyway, this is another cultural tradition that gets transported first to the British people, and then eventually to the American people, and that was the idea that you should go outside in the middle of the winter and cut down a tree and bring it into your house. This is the Christmas tree, right? Oh, Tannenbaum. This was a German tradition that Albert had brought from Germany, and then this picture gets circulated in Britain, and then Americans start doing it, until eventually, for some reason, in my attic to this day, I have this phony aluminum, and I don't know, whatever the leaves are made of, tree in a box, and every year I take it out, put it back together, and then a few months later I take it apart and put it back up in the attic. It doesn't make any sense to me either, but I got to do it because my wife tells me I have to. So, this is what they're doing. They're standing around the Christmas tree. The presents are underneath it. The little half-German princes and princesses are there. You can still go to the mall and some other places that sell cheesy, kitschy kind of stuff and have Victorian-era photos taken of you and your family. So they're still having a lasting cultural impact on us today. Here are a few scenes from the American Civil War. This is Stonewall Jackson's Second Corps of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia launching this giant flank attack on Union forces at the Battle of Chancellorsville. This is us, this is me and a bunch of other reenactors. We were forced into submission at the Battle of Sailor's Creek, where about a third of Lee's army was cut off and surrounded, and then 3 days later, Lee would surrender the rest of his army. And there he is, there's Lee, and he's surrendering the army to Grant, and that is going to be the end of the American Civil War. Right? Well, we talked about Marxism before, so I'm not going to go over it in great detail now, right? But this overall idea of increased industrialization is going to really pick up Marxism and carry it along for a long time. And so this is something that's going to be a major factor as we see Marxism evolve over time, right? Now, one of the other major intellectual changes or one of the major sets of these, and we'll break it down into several subsets, is going to be science. Science in relationship to humanity. As we talked about before, science in the 1500s and the 1600s, scientific revolution, and it leads into the Enlightenment. One of the major factors we got to talk about is ideas, where they come from, how they affect us. Right? One of our major idea factors is going to come from Charles Darwin, although what I'm going to talk about is probably not what you're thinking. Right? Now, for those of you who have no idea, Darwin. I've heard that somewhere before. What is it? Right? Okay. Darwin is a British naturalist. Right? He studies the natural world. He might be what you and I would call a biologist today, right? Darwin travels to the Galapagos Islands. I think he's the Beagle or something was the name of his ship, and he noted this wide variety of different species that were untouched for the most part by human forces on the Galapagos Islands. And they get the lizards and the birds and the etc. Right? And so eventually, what you're going to see is due to this trip and his overall research, is he's going to come to this conclusion that animals had evolved over time in response to their environment. Okay? He described in his book, The Origin of Species, how survival of what he called the fit, right, had led to new species over time through the appearance of variants. All right? The more modern scientific term might be genetic mutations, right? Spontaneous genetic mutations, right? And they had passed down over to these new generations, and the successful mutations led to successful passing along of these genetic material, etc., etc. Okay? Darwin would later apply the same principles to humanity. Human beings being, in his concept, an animal like anything else. And he called, in his book, The Descent of Man. His conclusion was that there was a mammalian progenitor for humans. Right? There was a great ape, for example, that allowed for the similarities between humanity, for example, and chimpanzees. All right? Now, there's a lot of debate that would rage then, and still today, about where's the morality in Darwin's claims. Are humans an accident, right? Is there morality in a godless universe? Okay, science has generally come to accept Darwin's ideas as gospel. A little joke on my part, right? The reason that this is important for us, though, is people have taken Darwin's ideas and they've applied them to a lot of other things other than just species on the planet. Okay? And this is why it's important for us. So I have this whole slide, which is basically just a lead-up for the last two lines. All right? And that is people taking the ideas of Darwin and applying them to society as a whole. Economics, business, war, government, nations, right? That the fit nations, the fit governments, the fit races of people. You'll see the eugenics movement is very Darwinistic. Okay? Hitler was very Darwinistic in the idea that the Jews are subhuman, you got to get rid of them. Right? they're going to apply this in a lot of different ways. You know, the good companies are going to survive, the bad companies are going to go out of business, and they should leave it alone because it's natural selection. It's natural selection of economies. So there are going to be people that are going to take this idea, they're going to use it in a lot of ways. So you don't necessarily have to wade into the whole you know, man and monkeys, you know, kind of side of this for understanding how Darwin has influenced society. So there's Darwin, right? He's just hanging out. Wicked cool beard, though, right? And of course, you can see Darwin catches a lot of criticism. So there's somebody's put Darwin's head on a monkey's body, which, regardless of what you think about it, right, is still pretty entertaining, right? So there's on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of. So anyway, a little bit of fun there with some Darwin. All right. One of the other major changes that's going to take place scientifically is in the medical field. The early 1800s, or you know, prior to the 1900s, really, I don't think most of us would want to get sick. Right? Getting sick would, you know, there's a good chance to kill you. So I wouldn't advise it. But the reason for that is some of the major changes going to take place mid to late 1800s as a result of this. And so we're going to talk about these and how they influence people and their views on society and on the world. All right? 1857, for example, a chemist named Louis Pasteur, he's French, right? He proved that fermentation, all right? So the big surprise, he's working on wine in France, all right? He's working on this, and fermentation is actually the product of microorganisms. Now, for those of you that know anything about wine fermentation or alcoholic fermentation, yeah, you got the little yeast molecules and they eat the sugar, I think, and then they poop out alcohol or something like that. Anyway, that's exactly how it works. You can't see them unless you've got a microscope, okay? And he's working on this bacteria that gets into wine and taints the wine, so he's a pretty typical French kind of guy. He's worried about his wine. And you know, if you're French, I don't see why, you know, that's too far out of the norm. By 1863, he had developed this technique where you go into with this bacteria with heat. The heat kills the bacteria, and then the bacteria won't taint the wine. So you can drink as much wine as you want, I suppose. All right. Now you take this to its logical conclusion, and the outgrowth of this work was what you and I would refer to as germ theory, where the reason that you get sick is bacteria or a virus or something gets into you and starts, you know, multiplying, and it takes over, and it causes all kinds of problems. So if you can kill or manage these microorganisms, then the disease will go away. And this is something where there's a vaccine to create the antibodies that your body needs to fight off one of these foreign invaders, or whether it's, you know, some kind of chemical, some kind of antibacterial agent, whatever it is. The idea is you're going to manage the microorganism. You're going to get rid of it as much as possible. Okay, and that's going to solve your disease problem. This was something that was radical and new. Okay, until you can actually prove that it's microorganisms making people sick, they're not really going to know for sure. Okay, Pasteur subsequently invented a rabies vaccine. He's going to pave the way for future vaccines of diphtheria, typhoid fever, cholera, and polio. Many of these diseases you'll read about in the textbook. Okay, odds are good, you know, probably you don't know anybody that's had polio. I mean, you read about, didn't Franklin Roosevelt, U.S. president, he have polio? Yeah, he did in like the 1930s and 1940s. Okay, it's been a while since there was any serious part of the population that had polio. There's a vaccine that came out, it got rid of it. Okay. So there are all these vaccines that come out that have relegated some of these real human killers, large parts of the population of people that are either killed or badly debilitated through most of their lives because of these diseases, okay, that you only read about in a history book now. You only read about, you know, I've never known anybody that had smallpox, okay, but you read about this kind of stuff and it wiped out something like 90% of the American Indian population, all right? So there are vaccines for this kind of stuff that are major changes in terms of human beings and how they live. Right? You're also going to see Joseph Lister, who you can get the advent of his product, right, Listerine, still today. He's going to aid medicine by introducing carbolic acid, which is a disinfectant. I don't know that you want to put carbolic acid over everything, but the idea that you're going to have some kind of disinfectant into a hospital where you're going to treat, you know, the hands, you're going to treat the surgical tools, the idea that you don't want to get bacteria into people that you're doing surgery on, it's going to radically reduce the post-operative mortality rate of a lot of these people. This is one of the things that you especially see in relationship to battles, because you get a lot of crushed and shot limbs and things like that. Okay, you get shot here, we're going to have to take your leg off. And they would take the leg off, oh, that's pretty bad, and then okay, we get to just, okay, you're going to be okay. A lot of these people would not die from the amputation. They would die from the infection that would get in the wound because they've got to cut you with a knife to get the leg off. this is going to radically reduce the amount of bacteria that gets in there because they're not going to be pumping you full of bacteria as they're cutting on you. Right? The medical profession itself becomes, as a whole, a lot more professional thanks to many of these new medical practices and medical schools. In many cases, if you wanted to be a doctor, you just moved to a town where nobody knew you. Because for the most part, doctors in the mid to late 1800s in a lot of places, they weren't much worse off than people who had actually gone to some of these 6-week medical schools. They gave you a pill for this, they gave you a pill for that. These people actually did some research. And while there's still a lot of criticism of the medical industry today, are they actually fixing things? Are they just dealing with the symptoms? I mean, I'm not going to get into that. But this is a period where they are going to try to be much more scientific and much more thorough in their training. And you'll see one of the major changes is something that's going to stick around, and that is the introduction of a white lab coat. If you think about it, doctors don't need to wear a white lab coat. In fact, some, today they don't do it. But that was the symbol for a long time. You wore the white lab coat. They don't work in a lab. They're doctors, right? You would think white would be bad, especially cutting on people, with blood going everywhere. The reason for that was it made you look like a scientist, and this is how high people held science in esteem at this point. So there's Pasteur. He's working hard looking at bacteria or whatever. Again, he's got to fix that wine, right? He's a French guy. There's Lister, and he is applying his disinfectant techniques to people who have had surgery. And there they are at this medical school working on this kind of stuff. And so this is going to be a major change as well. As you know, one of the things I like to do is to stop as we go through these major periods of history and say, okay, well, how is art reflecting what is going on with people and their thinking in large parts of the world? And you'll see that post-1848, Romanticism is still kind of there, right? But for the most part, it's going to be going away because people don't feel this great sort of swell of Romanticism. It's going to be replaced by realism and nationalism, depending on what artistic form we're talking about. And so part of that, of course, is going to be dealing with the fact that a lot of these people had very high expectations. When we're going to have these nationalist revolutions, we're going to have these liberal reforms, and 1848 happens, and we're, for the most part, crushed. We're crushed by these autocratic regimes. And so we want something that's a lot more realistic. So the literary heroes of great deeds and exciting times are kind of gone. Instead, you've got much more realistic characters in realistic, maybe even drab kind of settings, and they're eking out some normal, if not, in some cases, hopeless kind of lives. Flaubert, Thackeray, and Charles Dickens really exemplifies this field. If you read one Dickens, you've kind of read them all, right? Where you've got this poor little orphan kid who's dealing with this ridiculously depressing life in London and trying to get ahead in the world, and he's doing something, he's okay, and then he's not okay, and of course he falls in love with this ridiculously stupid girl, right? Who treats him like crap, but he really likes her because she's hot and probably rich. But so anyway. This is what you're going to see. It's very realistic, and it's pretty drab, right? Now, in art, realism doesn't totally get rid of Romanticism, or Romanticism doesn't totally go away. It does run kind of on parallel tracks with it, right? But instead of these mythical scenes, the realists focused on glimpses of social realism. This is what's going on. This is what you'd see, and this is what's going on around us, right? Now, in the musical genres, right? Realism is going to give way to the sentiments of nationalism and the desire for music and musical theater, especially when we talk about operas and things like that, to represent the nation's culture on a grand stage. We're going to put this out there. This proves how awesome Poland is, or Norway, or Germany, or whatever, right? Look at this great art that we've produced. It's endemic of us, right? That's nationalism in music. Now, the greatest achievement of this is going to, of course, be Richard Wagner, right? Now, I know it looks like Richard Wagner, but it's not. Richard Wagner, right? And he, not only is he a great nationalist kind of composer, and he really gives voice to a lot of the sometimes kooky Germanic sensibilities of their culture, but also he was just a great, musical person. He's one of these brilliant, artists of all time. And he fuses this idea of opera, drama, symphony, spectacle, the stage, right, and nationalism. The greatest achievement of this, and not the only one, is the Nibelungen, right, which is sort of the Lord of the Rings of the 1800s, right? It's the myths of these Germanic gods and this ancient mythology, and you've got these guys fighting dragons, and Valkyries come down for dead guys, and so it's really kind of off the chain, kind of stuff there, right? So there's Charles Dickens, right? There's A Tale of Two Cities, and it's very realistic in that everybody that is a character in this, and if you think about how many people do you know who you run into on a day-to-day basis, right? Well, they all have lives, they all have friends, and so this is one of the things, you read Tale of Two Cities, and how many characters you have to keep track of is just mind-boggling. I think I only made it through like half of this before I eventually, I think I tried to throw myself in front of a train or something, because it was just too much to kind of keep track of in terms of population. This is the realism that you can see in art, right? This is the working class car on the railway line, and you've got, these are very attractive people. They got their work in hand, the old lady's got wrinkles, one lady's, she's got dirty fingers, and she breastfeeds her kid. I mean, this is just what you'd see on a railway car if you bought the cheap ticket with this. And on the other end of this, you've got this extreme German nationalism. There's Siegfried, and he's fighting this dragon, and the giant paper-mache dragon comes out, and he's got to deal with this. And you get the wolves, and the gods are singing because somebody set Valhalla on fire, and the Valkyries are singing to each other because all the warriors are slain. And then the fat lady at the end of Die Valkyrie, right? She's upset because Siegfried he's dying, and she loves him, and he's going to expire. It's right? It's huge kind of stuff, right? Every character has its own leitmotif, right? The modern action film with its symphonics gets a lot of its influence from Wagner. Just really brilliant kind of stuff all the way around, but it also exemplifies nationalist music in its forms. And so we've seen this advance, seen how this evolves, and we'll see next time how it evolves some more.